Clem Tucker lay pinned under a ton of jagged slate, his lungs burning as the first demolition charges shook the very foundation of Pine Ridge. Above him, a massive, scarred mountain lion, the legendary shadow cat, was snarling through the dust, its front paw crushed by the same debris that held Clem captive. As the ground groaned and a century of corporate secrets prepared to vanish in a cloud of dynamite and fire, Clem fumbled for his audio recorder, desperate to capture one last piece of evidence before the mountain became his tomb. He hit play, but there were no animal growls or mechanical hums. Instead, the crystal-clear voice of his estranged daughter filled the collapsing cavern, whispering a secret she had taken to her grave years ago. Clem stared at the metallic claw fragment embedded in his own shoulder, a piece of high-tensile industrial steel slick with fresh, warm blood. As the countdown echoed through the hollowed-out coal veins, Clem realized the town wasn't detonating the ridge to hide a monster, but to bury what was still screaming beneath the stone. The receiver's alarm clawed at Clem's eardrums, a jagged whine cutting through the damp pine air. He didn't need the screen's red flashing to tell him something was wrong. The way his pulse hammered against his ribs did that just fine. The briars snagged at his sleeves, thorns biting through the worn fabric like tiny, hungry teeth. He yanked his arm free, leaving a trail of torn threads and a thin line of blood welling along his forearm. Ahead, the underbrush thinned into a clearing where the research station's chain-link fence sagged under the weight of something massive. Clem skidded to a stop, boots kicking up damp earth. The air smelled wrong, ozone and wet metal, like a storm had rolled in without the rain. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, fogging the cold plastic of the receiver's screen. The fence groaned. A single link snapped, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. Clem's fingers tightened around the device. Proximity breach. Unidentified mass. The words blurred as his vision tunneled. He should have checked the cameras, should have listened when Dr. Hayes warned about the budget cuts, the missing sensor logs. But now the fence bowed inward, the metal screaming as something on the other side pushed. A low, guttural click echoed from the trees. Not an animal. Not the wind. Clem's throat went dry. He took a step back, then another, his heel catching on a root. The receiver's alarm spiked, the pitch climbing into something almost human. A scream. The fence tore open. Clem didn't wait to see what stepped through. He pivoted, his joints protesting the sudden shift in momentum, and dove back into the suffocating embrace of the Appalachian brush. The receiver in his hand was no longer a tool of science. It was a frantic, living thing, pulsing with a light that felt like a target on his back. Every stride through the tangled mountain laurel felt like a gamble with gravity. The signal pitch shifted, rising into a frequency that set his molars aching, a frantic staccato that mirrored his thudding heart. He was 48 years old, his lungs burning with the acrid taste of pine resin and panic. Yet he moved with the desperate agility of a man who knew exactly what happened to things that stayed still on Pine Ridge. The topography of the ridge was a nightmare of hidden dips and jagged slate outcroppings, all obscured by a carpet of rotting needles that turned slick as grease under his boots. He checked the screen. The breach wasn't just a point on a map anymore. It was a spreading stain of red, a thermal ghost that moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He had to get to the secondary relay, but the mountain seemed to be folding in on itself, the familiar trails vanishing behind a veil of shifting shadows. The entity wasn't just following, it was reclaiming the space. Clem heard the sound of a heavy-duty steel post being uprooted, the shriek of metal being twisted like wet paper. He didn't look back. He knew the dimensions of his perimeter fence, reinforced galvanized steel, set 4 feet deep in concrete. Whatever had just stepped through it possessed a mass that defied the local fauna. It wasn't a bear, and it certainly wasn't the stray cattle the locals grumbled about. The sheer violence of the intrusion suggested an intentionality, an aggression that chilled him more than the mountain wind. He reached a rocky vantage point, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing hitches, and dared a glance toward the clearing. The research station was a ruin. The tents he'd spent weeks securing were shredded ribbons of canvas, and the delicate seismic arrays were being crushed under a weight that left deep, rectangular gouges in the earth. It was a systematic destruction of his life's work, a silent declaration that his presence was no longer tolerated. The scale of the entity, even viewed through the distorting lens of the rising mist, was impossible. A hunched, shifting silhouette that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Desperation forced his hands into a frantic rhythm. He fumbled with the dials of his thermal scanner, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped the unit into the dark maw of the ravine below. He needed a lock, something to take back to the university to justify the thousands of dollars in ruined hardware now littering the ridge. When the screen finally flickered to life, the image that greeted him made him forget to breathe. The heat signature wasn't a solid mass of orange and red. It was a fractured kaleidoscope of impossible temperatures. One moment, the entity registered at a blistering 140 degrees. The next, it plummeted to a sub-zero blue that shouldn't have been possible in the humid night air. It flickered like a dying fluorescent bulb, a ghost in the machine that defied every law of thermodynamics Clem had ever taught. This wasn't biology. It wasn't even a malfunction. It was a violation of the natural order. A thermal anomaly that suggested the thing standing in his camp was less a creature and more a tear in the fabric of the world itself. The sound of a vehicle laboring up the access road broke the spell of his terror. Headlights cut through the trees, sweeping across the pines in long, sickly yellow fingers. Clem hunkered down, pressing his chest against the cold, wet stone of the ridge. It was Sarah's truck, the green and white of the Park Service. She skidded to a halt near the edge of his perimeter, the engine idling with a rough, metallic knock. When she stepped out, her face was a mask of grim professional concern, her eyes immediately finding the wreckage of the fence. "Clem!" she shouted, her voice thin against the vast, oppressive silence of the mountain. He scrambled down from his perch, sliding the last few feet on his backside, mud caking his flannel shirt. She didn't offer a hand. She just looked at him, then at the ruins. "It's over, Clem. I just got the word from the university liaison. The grant is dead. You've got 48 hours to vacate, and that was before whatever this has happened." She gestured to the shredded camp, her jaw set in that hard line he'd come to recognize as her danger signal. Sarah didn't stop there. She stepped closer, the smell of her damp wool jacket and peppermint gum a jarring reminder of a world that made sense. The town council didn't wait for the university to sign the papers, Clem. Calloway and Boone, they pushed through a forced removal order this afternoon. The sheriff's deputies are probably loading their gear into the cruisers right now. She looked at his shaking hands, her green eyes softening for a microsecond before hardening again. "They don't want you here. They never did. This ridge is a powder keg, and you've been sitting on it with a magnifying glass. If you don't pack what's left of your life into that truck and drive down to the valley right now, they'll seize everything. Your data, your logs, the whole damn mess. You'll leave here with nothing but the clothes on your back and a lawsuit." The wind picked up, rattling the torn canvas of the command tent, sounding like a chorus of dry, mocking laughter. "I can't leave," Clem rasped, his voice sounding like gravel being ground in a mortar. "The logs, Sarah. The remote station at the Devil's Throat, it's still recording. If I can get that audio, I can prove what I saw. I can prove it's not just some mountain lion or landslide." Sarah looked at him like he was a drowning man refusing a rope. She knew the obsession that lived in the hollows of his eyes. She'd seen it before in the men who stayed too long on the ridge. "Fine," she snapped, reaching into her belt and pulling out a heavy maglite. "One trip. We go to the throat, we get the log, and then we are gone. I'm not losing my badge because you've got a crush on a ghost." They moved through the dark together, a silent pact of desperation. The forest felt different now. Heavier, the air thick with a static charge that made the hair on Clem's arms stand up. They reached the hidden transmitter, tucked into a crevice of lichen-covered granite. Clem's fingers flew over the keypad, the red record light blinking a steady, rhythmic pulse that felt like a heartbeat. The silence of the woods was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic snap of dry branches. It wasn't the fluid movement of the entity. It was the heavy, deliberate tread of men in boots. From the shadows of the hemlocks, 5 figures emerged, their faces obscured by the knit wool of hunting masks. At their center stood Harlan Reed, the mine foreman, his barrel chest heaving, a crowbar gripped in one massive, grease-stained hand. "Professor," Harlan spat, the word a curse. "Told you what happens to trespassers. Told you the ridge belongs to the company." The miners fanned out, cutting off the path back to the truck. They didn't look like men enforcing a council order. They looked like a pack of wolves that had finally cornered the elk. Sarah stepped forward, her hand hovering near her holster. But Harlan just laughed, a deep, booming sound that had no mirth in it. "Give us the gear, Tucker. The recorders, the tapes, all of it. We're cleaning up this mountain, and we don't need your science cluttering up the works." Clem felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. He wasn't a fighter, he was a man of graphs and decibels. But the thought of Harlan's thick, clumsy fingers on his data, on the only proof he had left, triggered something primal. When the nearest miner lunged for the recording deck, Clem didn't think. He swung the heavy, lead-acid battery pack he'd been carrying for the sensors. The weight of it was substantial, a solid block of plastic and lead that connected with the man's ribs with a sickening wet crunch. The miner went down in the muck with a choked gasp. "Clem, run!" Sarah screamed, and the clearing erupted into a chaotic blur of mud and violence. Another man grabbed Clem's collar, the smell of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey filling his nose. Clem drove an elbow back, feeling the jarring impact against a jaw, and twisted away. He saw Sarah go down under 2 of them, her flashlight spinning across the ground, illuminating the frantic, rain-slicked leaves in a strobe light nightmare. He couldn't help her. The realization gutted him, but 3 more were closing in, and Harlan was roaring orders. Clem turned and bolted toward the lip of the ravine, his boots sliding on the treacherous edge. He heard the foreman's heavy footsteps behind him, the whistle of the crowbar cutting the air. With a desperate, blind leap, Clem threw himself over the side. The world became a vertical slide of shale and stinging branches. He tumbled, the recording deck clutched to his chest like a holy relic, his shoulders slamming into a sapling that slowed his descent just enough to keep his skull from cracking against the boulders at the bottom. He landed in a heap of dead leaves and icy water. The breath knocked out of him, his vision swimming in a sea of gray sparks. Above, he heard the shouts of the miners, their flashlights probing the dark. But the ravine was deep and choked with shadow. For now, he was a ghost among ghosts. He lay there for a long time, the cold seeping through his clothes, listening to the blood roar in his ears. When he finally moved, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic in the mud. He fumbled for his penlight, the small beam revealing a heavy-duty animal trap. Its steel jaws snapped shut with enough force to sever a limb. But it wasn't empty. Embedded in the serrated teeth was a jagged fragment of metal. A claw, nearly 6 inches long, curved and wickedly sharp. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and pulled it free. It wasn't bone. It wasn't even the rusted iron of the old mining tools. It was a dark, matte alloy that felt unnaturally heavy, the edges still humming with a faint, residual vibration. He ran a thumb along the flat of the blade, and his heart skipped. The metal was warm, not the warmth of a sun-baked rock, but the thrumming internal heat of something that had been part of a living body. He sat back against the damp stone wall of the ravine, the claw in one hand and the audio player in the other. He was a ruin of a man, bleeding, hunted, and professionally dead. But he had it. He had the proof. His thumb found the play button on the recording deck, his eyes closing as he prepared to hear the guttural roars or mechanical whirring that would vindicate his madness. The speakers crackled with static, the white noise of the mountain wind. Then, the static cleared. A voice emerged from the darkness, soft and hesitant, but unmistakable. "Daddy? Clement? You have to stop digging. The mountain, it doesn't forget where the bodies are. It doesn't forget me." Clem's breath hitched, a sob catching in his throat. It was Maeve, his daughter. The voice was exactly as it had been 10 years ago, the night she'd vanished into these same woods. It was impossible. She was 18 now, a stranger in another state. But the voice on the tape was the child he'd lost. The mountain wasn't just hiding a creature. It was holding a mirror to his greatest failure. The sky above the ravine didn't just turn gray. It bruised into a deep, sickly purple. Clem's emergency radio, clipped to his belt, began to emit a frantic, rhythmic chirping, the flash flood alert. In these mountains, a heavy rain didn't just mean mud. It meant a wall of water that could scour a ravine clean in minutes. He looked at the steep walls around him, then at the sky. The first heavy drops began to fall, fat and cold, splashing against the metallic claw in his lap. If he stayed here, the evidence would be buried under a ton of silt and debris. If he moved, he was walking back into the arms of Harlan's hunters. The pressure in his chest felt like a physical weight, a tightening band that made every breath a struggle. He had to get out. He had to secure the claw. But the mountain seemed to be waking up, the very earth vibrating with the approach of the storm. As he scrambled to find a foothold in the crumbling slate, a new sound joined the thunder. The low, guttural growl of an engine, not a truck, but something much heavier. He reached the rim of the ravine and peered through the hemlocks. The foreman hadn't given up. Harlan was back, and this time he'd brought the company's D9 bulldozer. The massive yellow machine sat idling at the edge of the clearing, its blade reflecting the lightning like a guillotine. Harlan stood in the cab, a legal document clutched in his hand, shouting over the roar of the diesel engine. They weren't just looking for Clem anymore. They were going to erase the habitat. They were going to level the ridge under the guise of an emergency safety clearing. "Clear it all," Harlan bellowed, his voice amplified by a megaphone. "Seal the vents. I want this ridge flat by morning." The bulldozer lurched forward, the steel tracks grinding against the bedrock with a sound that felt like teeth on bone. Clem knew he had to reach his truck. It was his only chance to get the claw and the recording to the authorities in the next county over, away from Calloway's reach. He skirted the edge of the clearing, moving like a shadow through the thickening rain. He reached the old logging road where he'd left the F-150, his fingers already digging for his keys. He dived into the cab, the smell of stale coffee and old upholstery a brief sanctuary. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned. The starter groaned, a pathetic, dying sound. He tried again, Nothing. He popped the hood and stumbled out into the downpour, his flashlight beam cutting through the steam rising from the block. The air intake was choked with white, crystalline granules. Salt. They'd salted his engine. He slammed his fist against the fender, a wordless cry of rage lost in the wind. He was trapped. The truck was a 2-ton paperweight, and the bulldozer was already beginning to chew through the tree line, moving toward him with a slow, inevitable malice. The mechanical roar was deafening now. The D9 was a wall of yellow steel, toppling ancient pines like they were toothpicks. Clem scrambled back, the mud pulling at his boots, forcing him deeper into the unstable, rocky terrain toward the summit. He could see the silhouettes of the miners moving in the periphery, their flashlights like searching eyes. He was being herded. Every path back to the valley was being systematically closed off by falling timber and the relentless advance of the blade. He reached a narrow shelf of rock, his back against a sheer cliff, and watched as the bulldozer crushed his remaining sensor arrays into the dirt. The destruction was total. He looked down at the claw in his hand, the metal now pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heat that seemed to respond to the vibration of the machinery. It wasn't a tool, it was a sensor, and it was telling him that the mountain was screaming. He reached for his compass, hoping to find a way through the dense fog that was now rolling in off the peaks. The needle didn't point north. It didn't point anywhere. It spun in a frantic, blurred circle, a silver dervish driven mad by an invisible force. The air felt thick, charged with a static that made the hair on his neck stand up, and the taste of copper fill his mouth. He pulled his thermal camera from his pack, his last working piece of equipment. He panned it across the rock face behind him, expecting the cold blue of dormant stone. Instead, the screen showed 3 distinct, human-shaped silhouettes. They weren't standing in front of the rock. They were inside it. They were motionless, glowing with a steady, haunting orange heat that defied every law of physics Clem had ever studied. He reached out to touch the stone, his fingers meeting only cold, unyielding granite. But the camera insisted there was life, or something like it, pulsating within the very bones of the ridge. He couldn't stay. The silhouettes seemed to shift, a slow tectonic movement that suggested they were aware of his gaze. He turned and began a desperate trek on foot, the mud now a rising tide that threatened to pull him under with every step. He climbed blindly, his lungs screaming, his vision narrowing to the small circle of his flashlight beam. He reached a high vantage point, hoping to see a break in the trees, away down the western flank. Instead, he saw the foreman's crew setting up a perimeter of floodlights. They were turning the ridge into a stage, a bright, artificial island in the sea of the storm. He was a rat in a maze, and the walls were starting to move. He looked down at his hands. They were caked in a dark, oily mud that smelled of sulfur and old blood. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was part of the mountain's anatomy, a stray nerve ending being squeezed by the closing jaw of the town's secrets. The sound that broke his spirit wasn't the bulldozer or the thunder. It was a high-pitched, keening whine that set his teeth on edge, a frequency so low it vibrated in his very marrow. From the darkness of the scrub oaks, a dozen pairs of yellow eyes ignited. The feral dogs. He'd seen them before. Starving, half-wild curs that lived off the town's refuse. But these were different. Their ribs pressed against matted fur, their muzzles dripping with a black, viscous foam. They didn't bark. They emitted a low, rhythmic chattering that matched the spinning of his compass. They moved in a coordinated arc, herding him toward the edge of a slippery, rain-slicked ledge. Clem backed away, his heels hanging over a 300-foot drop into the black maw of the valley. The lead dog, a scarred mastiff mix with one milky eye, stepped forward, its throat vibrating with that impossible subsonic hum. He had no choice. He pulled the flare gun from his belt, his fingers slick with rain. He didn't fire at the sky. He fired directly into the mud at the lead dog's feet. The magnesium flare erupted in a blinding, white-hot hiss, the smell of ozone and burnt hair filling the air. The dogs recoiled, their sensitive eyes overwhelmed by the glare. Clem seized the moment, swinging his climbing axe with a desperate, clumsy strength. He caught the mastiff across the shoulder, the steel biting deep. The animal didn't yelp. It emitted a sound like grinding metal and fell back into the brush. The rest of the pack hesitated, their collective hum breaking into a discordant snarl. Clem didn't wait for them to recover. He scrambled along the narrow ledge, his fingers clawing at the wet lichen, his heart a frantic bird trapped in his ribs. He was alive, but the cost was being etched into his skin with every jagged rock and stinging branch. He found a shallow overhang, a narrow slit in the rock that offered a temporary shield from the torrential rain. He collapsed there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the metallic claw clutched to his chest. He pulled his small cleaning kit from his pocket, a rag and some solvent, and began to work on the fragment. As the layers of mountain mud and dried gore came away, the truth revealed itself in the cold light of his penlight. The claw wasn't a biological growth. It was etched with microscopic serial numbers, a series of alphanumeric codes that pointed to a specific manufacturer. Reed Industrial Drills. It was high-tensile steel, an alloy used for boring through the hardest granite in the deep shafts. But it wasn't a tool. It was shaped into a perfect anatomical mimicry of a predator's talon. It was a weapon, or a limb, and it was covered in blood that was still warm to the touch. A dark, rich crimson that shouldn't have been liquid after hours in the cold. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The entity wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a simple animal. It was a fusion, a grotesque marriage of high-tech industrial hardware and living, breathing tissue. Someone had been building something in the deep shafts, using the mountain's natural acoustics and the town's isolation as a laboratory. The Shadow Cat was a manufactured nightmare, a cybernetic hound designed to keep the town's secrets buried. Clem looked at the blood on his fingers, then at the claw. It was vibrating again, a low-frequency pulse that matched the heartbeat of the mountain. He wasn't just tracking a creature. He was tracking a secret that the town council was willing to kill to protect. And now, he was the only one who knew that the monster was made of the same steel that built the town. The satellite link on his handheld device chirped. A final, cold notification. Contract terminated. Access revoked. The university had officially cut the cord. He was no longer Professor Tucker. He was a trespasser on private corporate land. The isolation was now absolute. As the screen faded to black, a figure stepped out of the swirling mist at the mouth of his overhang. It wasn't a miner. It was Silas Vance, the old man who lived in the cabin at the ridge's base. He looked like he was carved from the mountain itself. His long duster coat heavy with rain, a double-barreled shotgun leveled squarely at Clem's chest. "You should have stayed in the classroom, Professor," Silas rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed to come from the earth. Some things don't want to be measured. Some things just want to be left in the dark. Silas didn't pull the trigger. He just stood there, a silent sentinel of the ridge's long, bloody memory. "The Shadow Cat," Silas said, his eyes like cold ash. "It's a story we tell the children to keep them away from the holes. But the holes, they're full of men who thought they could change the world with a union card and a pickaxe. 100 years of corporate greed, Professor. Calloway's grandfather, Reed's father. They buried the strikers in the deep veins. They used the cat to explain away the disappearances. It's a convenient ghost. He stepped closer, the muzzle of the shotgun inches from Clem's heart. But you started recording the echoes. You started hearing the voices of the dead in the wind. And they can't have that. They're going to blow the ridge tonight, Tucker. They're going to collapse the whole damn thing and seal those graves forever. And you're just one more body to add to the tally. Clem felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. He looked past Silas, toward the back of the overhang. The rock there wasn't solid. It was vibrating, a rhythmic, pulsing hum that matched the whispers on his daughter's tape. He saw a narrow fissure, a hidden entrance that seemed to breathe with the mountain. "The cave," Clem whispered. "That's where the sound comes from. It's not ghosts, Silas. It's the mountain itself. The hollowed-out veins, the wind. It's a natural amplifier. My daughter, her voice, it's an acoustic reflection." Silas looked at the fissure, his grip on the shotgun wavering for a fraction of a second. The ground beneath them groaned, a deep, tectonic shift that sent a shower of dust from the ceiling. The mining activity was getting closer. The charges were being set. Clem saw his opening. As Silas glanced toward the trembling floor, Clem lunged. He didn't go for the man. He went for the gun. They spiraled into a desperate, grunting struggle, the shotgun a heavy, cold weight between them. They crashed against the stone walls, the smell of wet wool and old tobacco filling the cramped space. Silas was old, but he was made of mountain granite, his hands like iron clamps on Clem's wrists. They stumbled toward the edge of the overhang, the ground beneath them beginning to crumble into a hidden, vertical shaft. A thunderous crack echoed through the ridge. Not thunder, but the first of the structural charges. The earth gave way. Clem felt the sickening lurch of gravity and rolled frantically toward the solid rock of the fissure. Silas wasn't as lucky. He disappeared into the dark maw of the mine shaft, his shotgun clattering against the walls as he fell. Clem lay on his stomach, peering over the edge of the new chasm. His pack, containing his thermal camera, his remaining sensors, and his primary recording deck, was gone, swallowed by the black throat of the mountain. He had nothing left but the steel claw in his pocket and the clothes on his back. No proof, no data, no way to convince the world that he wasn't a madman. The isolation was total, a suffocating blanket of silence that was broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of the next demolition charge being armed. He looked at the fissure, the hidden cave that whispered with his daughter's voice. It was the only way off the ridge that wasn't patrolled by Harlan's men. Silas's voice drifted up from the darkness, a pained, wet hack. He'd caught a ledge 20 feet down. "Tucker," he wheezed, "listen to me. The debt, it's not just a story. They've planted the charges in the primary coal veins. They're going to collapse the whole eastern flank. You're standing in the middle of a funeral pyre." Clem looked toward the valley. He could see the lights of the foreman's crew moving like fireflies along the ridge. They were finishing the wiring. He had minutes, maybe less. The whispers from the cave were louder now, a chorus of voices that sounded like 1,000 lost souls, all crying out in a language of wind and stone. He realized then that the shadow cat wasn't just a distraction. It was a psychological weapon. The town used the fear of the beast to keep people from investigating the strange sounds, the vibrations, the truth of the mass graves. And Harlan was using the current scare to justify a massive, illegal demolition that would erase the evidence of a century of crimes. Clem was the only witness left, and he was trapped in a labyrinth of his own making. He looked at his emergency radio, hoping for a miracle, but the display was a jumble of static. The electromagnetic field of the ridge, amplified by the coming explosion, had turned the mountain into a dead zone. He was alone with the ghosts, and the clock was ticking toward zero. The first major blast didn't just shake the ground, it rearranged the world. Clem was thrown forward, his head slamming into the limestone wall of the hidden cave as the ceiling of the overhang collapsed behind him. Dust, thick and acrid with the smell of ancient coal and modern plastic explosives, filled his lungs. He coughed, a racking, desperate sound, as he scrambled deeper into the darkness. The trash chute, a vertical ventilation shaft from the old mining days, had opened up above him, raining down a century's worth of debris. And then he saw it. Not a machine, not a ghost. The real shadow cat. It was a mountain lion, but unlike any Clem had ever seen. Massive, its coat a mottled, smoky gray, its body covered in a network of jagged, white scars. It was pinned beneath a fallen support beam, its golden eyes wide with a primal, uncomprehending terror. Clem froze. This was the source. This was the animal that had survived in the deep shafts, the one that Silas had been trying to protect. It wasn't a monster. It was a relic, a living ghost of a subspecies long thought extinct. The steel claw in Clem's pocket, it must have been a prosthetic, a cruel experiment by the company to see if they could enhance the local predator to serve as a more effective guardian. He looked at the beam crushing the animal's hindquarters. The cat growled, a low, vibrating sound that matched the frequency of the mountain's whispers. It was the only witness left to the crimes of Pine Ridge. If it died here, the truth died with it. Easy, girl, Clem whispered, his voice trembling. He found a length of iron pipe among the debris, a heavy, rusted lever. He wedged it under the beam, bracing his boots against a solid outcrop of quartz. He pushed with everything he had, his muscles screaming, his vision blurring with the effort. The beam groaned, shifting just enough. The cat didn't attack. It seemed to understand the desperate communion of the moment. It pulled its mangled limb free with a wet, sickening slide and vanished into a narrow side tunnel. Clem collapsed, the pipe clattering to the floor. He had no equipment, no career, and the mountain was falling down around him. But for the first time in 10 years, the shaking in his hands had stopped. He followed the cat. It was a blind trust, a leap of faith into the dark. But the animal knew the veins of this mountain better than any map. They moved through a labyrinth of hollowed-out coal, the air growing thinner, the sound of the explosions muffled by miles of stone. Clem used the echoes of his own footsteps, the way the wind whistled through the cracks, to navigate the collapsing tunnels. He was a surveyor of the dead, moving through a cathedral of forgotten sins. He reached a high, external ledge, just as the final, massive charge detonated. He watched, a tiny, insignificant speck against the night sky, as the entire eastern flank of Pine Ridge slumped into the valley in a slow, majestic roar of dust and fire. The evidence was gone. The graves were sealed. The secret was safe. Silas was waiting for him at the base of the trail, his duster torn, his face a map of exhaustion. He looked at Clem, then at the dark tree line where the shadow cat had vanished. "You saved her," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "She's the last of them. My grandfather. He found the first one in the deep shafts back in 22. We've been keeping him secret ever since. The company, they found out, tried to turn him into something they weren't. But you saw the animal, not the ghost." Silas reached out a hand, a gesture of peace that felt heavier than any mountain stone. "The ridge is gone, Tucker. But the secret is still alive." Clem pulled the final hard drive from his jacket, the one he'd managed to snatch from his pack before it fell. It contained the thermal images of the silhouettes, the audio of the whispers, the proof of the company's crimes. It was his career. It was his vindication. He looked at Silas, then at the quiet, devastated mountain. If he released this, the world would descend on Pine Ridge. National Geographic, the FBI, the developers, they would tear the valley apart looking for the shadow cat. The animal would end up in a cage, and Silas would end up in a cell. Clem walked to a jagged rock and, with a single deliberate motion, brought the hard drive down against the stone. The plastic shattered, the magnetic platters spinning away into the mud. He met the university representatives in a sterile office in the city a week later. He sat there, his arm in a sling, his face scarred, and told them exactly what they wanted to hear. Acoustic anomalies caused by structural instability. No evidence of biological or mechanical entities. The project was a failure. He accepted the professional disgrace, the termination of his tenure track, the quiet whispers of his colleagues. He didn't care. He had a new job now. He moved into a small cabin in the valley, a simple surveyor for the county. Every evening, he would sit on his porch and look up at the scarred remains of the ridge. He didn't need a receiver to hear the whispers anymore. He knew what they were. They were the sound of a mountain finally at peace, and the ghost of a daughter who was finally, truly free. He was the secret guardian of a living ghost, and for the first time in his life, the silence was enough.